Good afternoon, everyone. My name is David Harris. I'm with the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute for Race and Justice. I want to welcome you to Harvard Law School on behalf of Professor Grant Nagan and Dean Manning. We're very excited about today's event, and I realize we're running up against Bitcoin next door, and the end of the semester. But I think we have been wanting to do this for a while, and I think that the events that have overtaken us in Cambridge over the last couple of weeks make this conversation really especially important. As usual, I want to kind of give thanks and praise to Kelly Garvin, who makes things happen for us as a poster, get you here and everything. And I'm really also especially delighted to be able to introduce Isaac Gibbons, who has been working with us all year and is on his way to college soon, but is really responsible for today's event, for finding Mayor Hodges and making this happen. So with no further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Isaac to introduce the mayor.
Thanks so much, David. I also really appreciate the opportunity to do this work, and I'm very grateful for the Institute of giving me this opportunity. Before I introduce Mayor Hodges, I do just want to point out that this is honestly just going to be a very informal conversation between these three. They know each other pretty well, so we don't really feel much of a need for a moderator or anything like that. Betsy Hodges was the 47th mayor of Minneapolis. During her time in office, Mayor Hodges accomplished many progressive policy outcomes, including her cradle-to-cave cabinet, creating a zero-waste Minneapolis, helping small business thrive, mandating sick leave for all workers, and raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour. But we're here today to focus on the challenges Mayor Hodges and her team took on to implement some of the most progressive policing policies in the country. Thanks to the work of the mayor, community activists, the city council, and members of law enforcement, the Minneapolis Police Department, or the MPD, operates under new priorities that focus on its relationship with the communities it serves. As of 2016, MPD officers began training in procedural justice, crisis intervention training, and fair and impartial policing training. All members of the MPD are required to receive implicit bias training, and an early intervention system has been put in place to help identify and divert community members suffering from mental illness to treatment instead of jail. As the cornerstone of its procedures, the MPD has a sanctity of life policy, the idea that not only officers should go home safe, but that everyone should go home safe. Both setting these standards and continuing to uphold them hasn't been easy, and the conversations like these around hard-learned lessons from dealing with some of the most difficult social and legal issues our country's cities are facing need to be had with a level of openness and thoughtfulness. At our study group on local government at the Harvard Kennedy School, I've personally had the opportunity to hear from the mayor about the issues facing Minneapolis at length. I can confidently say that the level of experience in approaching issues around policing and building community trust with government that the mayor and our other guests bring to this conversation gives us an important perspective on what it takes to honestly make a difference in city government. With that, the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute is happy to introduce Betsy Hodges, Phillipe Cunningham, and Nicole Archbold to Harvard Law School.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Isaac, and thank you for coming all semester to the study groups and for the introduction to David and this work. I have a feeling you and I will be seeing each other more in the future, whatever the road carries. Indeed, that list, I think, shows a fraction of what's possible in local government when you really put your mind to it, your partners to it, and the organizing happens to make it possible. And all of those things are required. So today, I'm just going to say, I'm going to give a little timeline about the setup for the work in Minneapolis. Nicole Archbold was my public safety policy aide while I was mayor. She had, what had it been, 16 years in the police department before that. Incredibly qualified, and everything that we talk about today, all the good work that has happened in policing and public safety in Minneapolis. It's on. It's on. Okay. The good work that we did do in Minneapolis is in large measure because Nicole was there to lead the way on the ground day after day after day after day. Nicole has never gotten enough credit for the work that she's done to do the most progressive policing work that in the country. At least that was happening between 2014 and 2018. You know, as mayor, I had many different responsibilities, and most of my time was spent on public safety, but a lot of my time was spent on other things as well, and Nicole was there day in and day out to track our initiatives and make sure that they were going well, and to build the partnerships in the community at City Hall to make sure that they went well. And so that's one of the reasons I wanted to invite Nicole here today, is she knows sort of that on-the-ground experience. Phillipe Cunningham is currently the council member from the 4th Ward in the city of Minneapolis. He won in November. He beat the council president, whose family had represented that seat for 40 years.
47.
47. And I say that, and I say that just to say the level of accomplishment that he has already shown in his life to come to a place where he could wage the kind of grassroots campaign that could do that is significant. But it is a point of pride for me that before that, he was also my public policy aide for education and youth success. And that we had met one another, was it at an MBK convening at My Brother's Keeper?
It was the Youth Violence Prevention Executive Committee.
The Youth Violence Prevention Executive Committee work, where he was working in the education field, and I knew that I was going to hire somebody to do education work, and it was really the perfect fit. And what Phillipe brought to the table is not only, and I'm going to refer to you as Phillipe, although it's Councilmember Cunningham. I hope that's okay.
Yes, ma'am.
Councilmember Cunningham.
Please.
Brought to the table a lot of experience on education and thinking about young people, but also a lot of experience in the community and organizing. And I had a very much an organizing bent when I was mayor. And so his experience while we were working on the policing issues was helping us think well about the community and the community relationships, and also helping us to think well about young people, at many points who were the folks who were also protesting and organizing as community members. And so it was really important to make sure that we were thinking really well and really clearly about young people. And that is as true today as it was in 2015, as it was in 2013, as it was in 1968. When I ran for mayor the first time in 2013, I ran explicitly on a platform of racial equity, and explicitly on a platform that we had to think about, that white people have a role and a need to reduce the inequalities and inequities that we have between white people and people of color. In Minneapolis, progressive bastion of the Midwest, we have the biggest gaps between white people and people of color of almost any city in the country, on almost any measure that you care to name. Employment, education, housing, health, segregation, incarceration, all of that, the gaps between people of color and indigenous people are the biggest in the country. And that's in part because we're set up very well for white people to succeed. We have a lot of really good social systems and social structures in place for white people. And because white people are doing very well, the gap is bigger than in some other places where in Minneapolis, people of color and indigenous people are in many ways similarly situated to indigenous peoples and people of color in other cities. But the gap is bigger because we're really especially super duper well set up for white people to succeed. And I was open about that fact when I campaigned in 2013. And that the future of the city of Minneapolis depends on closing that gap, not by reducing outcomes for white people, but by elevating outcomes for people of color. And that requires changing every system we have. Steeping the DNA in our systems in something completely different. And I had experience at City Hall. I'd been on the City Council for 8 years. And I knew that if I really wanted to take that project on in a meaningful way, I had to do it from the mayor's office and not from my City Council office. So I ran and I was elected with a large majority. And part of the platform I had was about changes in policing, what we would now call 21st century policing. Some people call police reform, police accountability, whatever you call it. Making systems changes in how we think about policing and what we actually expect our officers to do and how we expect our police department to function has to be different for the outcomes to be different. If you do what you've always done, you will get what you've always gotten. And in Minneapolis, there was a history as in many cities, but there was a history of distrust, a history of police mistreatment of low-income people and people of color and indigenous people. That wasn't very much of a secret, and every person of color I know, every single one in Minneapolis, including family members, has a negative story about their interaction with the Minneapolis Police Department. Whether it's somebody who's been beat up, somebody who's been called names, somebody who's been unfairly stopped over and over and over. I know a lot of people of color in Minneapolis. I've had lots of conversation over time. I don't know a person who doesn't have their own story, either 40 years ago or 40 days ago or 40 hours ago. And so I had, when I ran, I had a platform that I laid out. Every officer wearing a body-worn camera, certain expectations about how our civilian review authority would work. I had a platform that was laid out, and I began to work on that platform right when I got in, which started with hiring Nicole, who could help, who knew the department and who knew the issues and could see everybody as human and could see everybody as see everybody as human, which is an important value to me walking in. Officers, community members, elected officials, everybody alike, and that we all had a role to play here. And we applied to be and were successfully part of something called the National Initiative for Building Community Trust and Justice, a partnership with the DOJ and John Jay and some other places. Selected 6 cities who had already made some progress on progressive policing to really work on 3 key, the 3 pillars of the national initiative are implicit bias, procedural justice, and racial reconciliation. And we were part of that already. We were selected in early 2015. I insisted that we apply, and I was glad, and I insisted that we accepted. And on November 15th, 2015, Jamar Clark was shot and killed by 2 Minneapolis police officers. He was an African-American man. I could go into the story of what happened, but it's not an unfamiliar story. He showed up, et cetera, et cetera. So if folks want to look it up or folks have questions about it, just know that he was shot in the head and killed by a Minneapolis police officer after having been taken to the ground by another Minneapolis police officer who were responding to a call from an ambulance. After that, something unusual happened. There was demonstrators were activated right away that day, that morning. And over the next 18 days, people occupied the grounds of the 4th Police Precinct, the police station that was about 3 blocks away from where Jamar Clark had been killed, and was also the site of a lot of turmoil and pain in the community in North Minneapolis, which Councilmember Cunningham represents. The 4th Precinct used to be a community center, and now it is a police station, if that tells you anything about some of the pain points that there are that just exist at the 4th Police Precinct. And what we did during those 18 days was something that a city had not done before. I don't know if a city has done since, but we successfully met the objective. The objective was to end that occupation as peacefully as possible. The objective was to not have the city burn down. The objective was to let people express their First Amendment rights, let people demonstrate and protest without putting the clamps down such that they felt they had to erupt in order to be heard, which is what had happened in other cities in one way or another. We were the first city to apply what are called 21st century policing principles to the situation. In other words, we were trying to negotiate. Every day, I was talking to one or more of the people who were protesting, trying to negotiate a peaceful ending to the occupation. At the same time, I was working with the chief to work with our officers to have them hold the line out there in ways that, not go out and immediately arrest everybody who was breaking a law. because to police officers, often law enforcement and public safety are the same thing. And so they were mystified that we were letting people have structures built on the grounds, have tents out there, have fires burning in the street. We let them close down the street. They were breaking laws. People were getting high. And for law enforcement officers who think law enforcement is the only way to public safety, the fact that we were allowing that and expecting them to allow it was very much a point of pain with the officers. And yet we did expect that, because to go out and arrest everybody the way that they wanted would have meant uprisings. It would have meant property damage. It would have meant people harmed and people died. And there was a night when counter-protesters, I guess you would call them, did come in and shoot 5 protesters. White people.
Sorry, did they identify as white supremacists?
Yes.
Yeah, they
okay.
identified as white supremacists.
They identified as white supremacists, so I will call them that. Came in and they shot 5 protesters, which I don't want to relive that moment ever. And every day of that occupation, we all knew that at any moment something horrible could happen. And sometimes it did. And my prayer every morning was to do what it took, to have the strength to do what it took to keep everybody as safe as possible. Neighbors, demonstrators, police officers, residents of the city, everybody as safe as possible, regardless of the impact to me personally, politically, or professionally. That was my prayer every morning, and I checked in with my gut every night. And so the fact that we were able to do that, the fact that when it flashes through your mind what the cities are that have had these extreme officer-involved shooting situations, Minneapolis is not the city that leaps to your mind. I'm not going to name them because you are naming them in your head, but Minneapolis, I'm guessing, was not on your list. And that is a point of pride for me. I'm guessing it's a point of pride for all of us, that we did what we could to work with the community, to work with demonstrators, and to work with officers to come to the best conclusion that we could. So the final part of that story is, at the end of that 18 days, we did end up having to go clear it out. We let people know it was coming at some point, days ahead of time. We gave people 10 minutes to clear out. At that point, there weren't very many people left. Most people just left. 8 people got arrested, but it was peaceable ending. And the community participated in that peacefulness as well for that whole 18 days. There were community members there working their tails off to make sure that things stayed as peaceful as possible and stayed as cool as possible in the face of some people who wanted more agitation. They wanted more violence. And the community did their part to make sure that things, stayed as safe as possible. And Nicole and Phillipe can talk about that as well. So the coda on that story is disruption is a very powerful tool. There weren't a lot of policy requests that came out of the demonstrators during the occupation. It was one of the difficulties. I couldn't negotiate with people who didn't ask me for things in return for them leaving. And that was difficult. The thing that they asked for, I couldn't provide. They wanted me to release the video tape of the shooting, which I couldn't do. And then they wanted me to call for the release of the videotape for that shooting. And I said no, because I on purpose asked for an independent investigation of that shooting so that the Minneapolis Police Department wasn't going to be investigating its own critical incidents. And I did not in any way want to impugn the integrity of that investigation by trying to insert myself into it as mayor by insisting that video be released. It's now more common that video will be released earlier. And I think that that is a good thing. But at the time, I did not want to be the one asking for that, because I did not want that investigation to be called into question in any way whatsoever by any city action. Disruption is a powerful tool. It creates an opening, it creates energy, and it creates focus on an issue. So it's a powerful tool in and of itself, even without policy requests that came. And what I did my best to do, and what we did our best to do in the wake of that, was use that energy, use that opening, use that focus to accelerate the pace of the work we were doing of change inside the police department. We doubled the budget for the training, so all officers by the end of 2016 got procedural justice training, implicit bias training, crisis intervention training. We accelerated the pace of officers getting body cameras, which had pluses and minuses to it. But we made sure to make that investment happen. And this was with a council who at the time was not, the majority of the council would not have made many of these changes unless their feet had been put to the almost literal fire by the opening that had been created by the demonstrations. And we did our best to take advantage of that moment to propel things even more quickly. So by the time I left office, and I stand by the statement, there isn't a city in the country who had done more, invested more quickly in the kinds of progressive policing reforms we want to see in cities than Minneapolis had done under our leadership. And so that's a point of pride for me. That's a point of pride for me. The coda to the coda is that last July, we had another high-profile officer-involved shooting. Officer Noor shot and killed Justine Damond in the alley of her home in southwest Minneapolis, and the dynamic was completely different. An officer of color, a Somali officer, had shot and killed a white woman, an Australian woman who was living in the United States in the southwest corner of the city, where the wealthiest part of the city and the whitest part of the city. And that also highlighted issues of policing. It was a chance for us to say these are the things that we are doing, but you can't always, it was awful and it was tragic and we still don't know why it happened. I'll just put it that way. Officer Noor to this day has not made a statement about why he fired his weapon. And he is being charged with a crime, and that is going through the system. But Minneapolis had been through it before. And the relationships were built so that when, again, the worst happened, we could communicate with one another. And I'll let Nicole talk about some of those lines of communication that had been opened before Jamar Clark got shot that made a huge difference during that occupation. And I'll let Phillipe talk about, and Nicole can also talk about what are some of the reforms that we did, what are some of the changes that we made. And Phillipe Councilmember Cunningham can talk about what those community aspects are, and how do you work with young people who may not know the ins and outs of every policy to ask for, but they know that the demand should be made. So that's the story of what happened. That's the outline of what happened. But to get the real picture of what it took and what the results were, I'm going to turn it over to Nicole and Councilmember Cunningham.
Good afternoon. So I'll start a little bit with my background, and I think that will help set the stage for why some of the relationship building or relationships that were called into play during these events were able to be called on. So I started with the police department in 2001 as an evidence technician. And what I did at that point was work directly with police officers who were coming right off of calls, bringing guns, drugs, money, wallets, biohazard things. They were bringing the evidence to me. I would inventory it, package it, and then eventually work to either return it to the rightful owners or provide it to the courts or whatever relevant forensic testing, et cetera. So through that time, for 7 years, I developed really close personal relationships with 800 police officers nearly. That was the heartbeat of the police department. Every court case, every arrest came through our office in some fashion. And as I said, being the first stop for officers after a very stressful, painful, traumatic incident or event or high adrenaline call or something like that, it really creates a bond with people. And I had a direct understanding of some of the challenges that other people didn't see. I had a lot of insight into the nuances of policing that a lot of people don't see. And in that, I also worked with community members who were coming to retrieve property, whether they were arrested or victims, business owners. And so I also developed empathy for people having to go through the system to try to obtain their property and some of the unnecessary hurdles that they face. And in that, I also learned about the impact that narratives have, you know, the us versus them, and whichever side you're on, what impacts those have on perspectives and the ability for police and community to interact with one another. So through that process, or through my time there, I earned a bachelor's degree in law enforcement and followed that with a master's degree in public safety administration. I moved, after 7 years, I moved up to our research and development division, and I wrote police policy and procedure and worked with police leadership for 6.5 years. And I did that prior to being asked to join the mayor's staff. So in that, I also learned hundreds of police policies. I wrote police policies. I went through the process of working with stakeholders 360 degrees to make sure that those policies were written well and understood by everyone, attorneys and court systems, and they had to be able to stand up to arbitrations and all those aspects of policing that, again, people don't always see. And it's not that interesting for a lot of people. Policy isn't something that jumps to mind when, you know, excitement in law enforcement.
Except for the three of us on stage,
Right.
who are all policy nerds.
Yes.
Let's just be honest.
Definitely. So in writing those policies and being trusted, you know, by police leadership and also seeking input and insight from police officers that were directly impacted by the policies, which is something that they hadn't experienced before, but I was able to do because they trusted me through my work that I had and relationships I had developed in the evidence room. So I joined Mayor Hodges' staff, and she doesn't know this, but we never talked about this part. During the campaign, there was a lot of feelings in the police department about candidates, in particular this one, because she was running on police reform. And so I understood like the constriction that was happening with the employees and the staff and how that was just playing out. And how language was so important in how people were hearing what she was talking about. And so it was a really interesting process for me. But when I joined the staff, there was a lot of impacts that had on my personal friendships, on relationships, work relationships, at all levels of the police department, some for the better and some for the worse. And in that process, the mayor and I worked through, you know, how to talk to police and how to talk about police and how to write statements that didn't make everybody shut down. You know, these are really important aspects of managing a police department. And I also learned what her platform was really about. And I understood from my years of experience writing policy, you know, everybody there, we called them a sergeant so-and-so clause or a officer this clause. Every time we had to adjust the policy because somebody did something that was against policy but not written down. So it wasn't technically a violation, right? So I understood the gaps in a lot of the loopholes. And then I understood what her policy charge was. And I also knew from those nuances of working in the evidence room, some of the things that I didn't see as wrong at the time, because I grew up in the city. My first job out of high school was 5 or 6 years before I started in the police department. So I understood only one perspective at that time about what was right. And that was just the way that the city did things and who got to have input in city policy or decisions. It was a very closed process.
Mm-hmm. As it is in most cities.
As it is in most cities. And that is what was radically different about working in Mayor Hodges' office, is that segment of the community who hadn't had a voice before had a voice. And they weren't wrong. And I knew this. And so that's part of what, like she said, I saw a lot of humanity in people. And it's because I really understood. And people would come to the mayor's office after they had tried and tried and tried and tried and tried to resolve issues through proper channels, through the channels that the government sets up. And it didn't work, you know, and there were things that were happening that shouldn't be happening. So again, I understood and I just had more compassion, I think, for people than they had normally experienced, and we were able to work through and resolve some of those things. So that sets up my knowledge and relationship component for internally in the police department and with some of our other government stakeholders. In the first year of Betsy's term, or second year it must have been, there was a community foundation who, post-Ferguson, knew that there were these tensions in our community and wanted to create an atmosphere where perspectives were able to be heard, and we were able to build relationships that would be needed to be called on should one of these civil uprisings happen in our city. We had 3 sessions. Our last session happened 2 weeks prior to Jamar Clark's shooting. And we had spent hours together building relationships with people, non-traditional relationships. We had
Who was in the group?
our city attorney, our deputy chief of police, myself from the mayor's office, Black Lives Matter representative, another community representative,
NAACP.
NAACP, and we had this wonderful facilitator who made it possible for us to have conversations and build relationships with each other. Like, it just seemed impossible, but it happened, and we were able to build relationships. And when Jamar Clark shooting happened, there were it was the relationships that I had developed through this process with this community foundation that our Department of Justice partners relied on for me to contact people and try to set up meetings and get people to start having the dialogue. It wasn't my job to have the dialogue with them, but to have people that had those skills to be able to have those dialogues about these really high-level things and to try to prevent the city from burning. So that was kind of the lead up, I think, of my work prior to Jamar Clark. And after Jamar Clark, we did a lot of work on policy, and as the mayor said, it accelerated the work that was being done.
I'm going to interject one thing here. So also before Jamar Clark had been shot, I think 4 or 5 days before, you had been in Florida doing an after action, like reviewing what the after action, what the lessons were that had been learned in Florida and in Ferguson and in some other places.
Sanford.
Yeah, it was in
Sanford.
where Trayvon Martin was killed.
And that first couple of days, we would literally sit in my office with Nicole and her notebook and her written down notes from there about what was right, what had gone well, and what had not gone well. And we were using that in the early hours as a playbook. We, she just said, look, they didn't do a community meeting until 4 days later. We should do one tonight. And it was like, okay. So the night that Jamar Clark was shot, we did a community meeting because you had those handwritten notes. We had access to someone who had actually led the DOJ process on the after actions in Baltimore and in Ferguson. And so I was on the phone with him constantly. What do we do? How do we do this? Getting help on the ground. And I can't say enough how important it is to get that feedback and that input from people who've been through it and share your values and perspective about wanting it to go well. But there is now something through Cities United, an organization called Cities United, a mayor's guide to police-involved shootings that you can find online and that I give to mayors, and it's part of my life now as I work with mayors around the country on these issues, and I can hand them that guide. And here, there are things cities can do now to make themselves stronger in case the worst thing happens. But there's also guidelines about what do you do if the unthinkable and the thing you never want to have happen happens, and what can you do afterward. That exists. And because Nicole had done that work, and what part of what you do is you expect your elected leaders to build relationships with people in the community so that they can have those conversations when the worst thing happens. That crisis is not the time you want to learn who the head of the NAACP in your city is. That was incredibly crucial. So that was the little sideline to how important it was that Nicole had been doing the work to get us ready.
So I left out one part of the occupation process, and then I'll skip the policy. We can come back to that, and I'll turn it over to you. But what was actually happening during those 18 days was we were in the office 20, 21 hours a day, sleeping on the office floor when we had 30 minutes in between calls or something. The mayor, for the first 2 days, all I remember was she was on her phone nonstop. And guess what? She missed somebody important. Remember? We had a list of people that you called.
Yes.
And but like it's like nonstop. And as she's on the phone, you're getting this real-time information about what's happening on the ground and what concerns the police department has and what are the resources. And whoa, what are you going to do in the police department? You can't do that right now. You're going to make it worse. And it was this dance of all these things and what was bubbling up to the top at that moment. And I think by day 2.5, I was in the office and I just had this feeling like, who's at the precinct? Like, who's got eyes on this from City Hall? So I went to the precinct not as someone to observe. I was there, I saw the outside. But I wanted to be inside and understand what was happening in the dynamics of all these officers who were literally trapped in the precinct. The third night, there was something that happened in the afternoon that really aggravated the situation. And that third night was the worst night of the 18 days. And Molotov cocktails were thrown. People were, it was mayhem. It was mayhem. And I had gone in the precinct at about 5 o'clock in the evening. They had allowed me into this gated area, and I parked my car there. And within 30 minutes of me being there, the precinct was surrounded on all sides. And there was no access or exit point for any of the officers in there. And I remember looking in the parking lot in this gated area, and I thought, there's an ambulance in there. And then, there was a cot inside, and, there's the paramedics on standby. But if something had happened at that time, there was no way for anyone to be helped from that precinct. And when you have officers are not used to being on that side of things, right? Where they're surrounded in their precinct, people are throwing bombs at their precinct, chanting the most vile, awful things to officers that are out there trying to hold the ground, keep people from charging at the precinct. And so it was a different perspective that I had, and it didn't mean that there weren't mistakes being done in the response outside. But I'm saying inside, that was something that I had, and I will say the privilege of seeing as an outsider. And that night, Twitter was blowing up, and the city council, we had 13 council members and a mayor. And so council was calling, well, what's going on? Why are they out there holding that gun? Why are they doing this? And why are they standing on the roof? And so I was in the precinct trying to facilitate answers. I'm like, what is this gun? And they said, it's a marking round. It's not a gun. Okay, it's this. And so relaying this information, trying to get accurate information out to the community. And so I was there and was going to leave, and then it erupted again, and I ended up not being able to safely leave the precinct until like 4:35 a.m. because shots were fired outside of the precinct, and they had to do a whole sweep of the neighborhood, send the SWAT unit out. And it really, to be on the ground in that dynamic, it was one night that was just, we didn't know. And at that point, that was day 3. So we knew what was possible if there was another strategic error in something that the police department wanted to do.
Yeah.
Right? And that is part of what really made the mayor pull back the reins on the police department, was because we didn't want that to escalate and have people be hurt. And that was something that became a very big friction point between the police and the mayor's office. And I'll tell you, 3 times, I believe, the mayor went to the precinct and sat in the roll call room and surrounded by officers that are trapped in their precinct, working 12, 15-hour shifts. And she took every question that they had. They were really upset, very angry, wanted to know why they couldn't just do this, and how can we justify that, and why are you letting them do this to us? And
This is like being bleeped in the bleep, and you should be bleeped in the bleep too, so you understand what this feels like?
Yeah.
they said that to her, yeah. So it was raw emotion on all sides, and understanding the hurt that the community felt, because there was a community narrative that continued to evolve throughout these 18 days. The police were involved in the protesters knew that there were white supremacists coming around and anarchists that would kind of pop up, and they wanted to see problems happen. And there were community members that it was like a community outside. And they had people that were in charge of cooking and cleaning and security. And the security folks knew that there were these people coming around, and they followed one time. And this is what happened, is a white supremacist had been around, walking around in the area, and got scared and started walking away really fast, and walked up the side street. And he saw an officer sitting in an unmarked car, and was like, "Can you give me a ride out here?" Right? The officer didn't know he was a white supremacist. The community did, but the officer didn't. The officer's like, yeah, it's crazy here, get in. And they drove him off. So what did the community see? The community saw a white supremacist get in a police car with a police officer and get driven away.
To safety.
And so we didn't know at the time all these things because it was a police officer from a different jurisdiction. It wasn't a Minneapolis police officer. But after the fact, all these pieces came together. But we still had to deal with, and one of the best pieces of advice we got from the Department of Justice is, it's not your narrative we need to communicate to them. We need to start with what the community narrative is. It doesn't matter right now what the real deal is. It matters what the community believes. And so starting there and then working again to try to bring some peace to it. So I spent every night there. After being in the office, instead of going home, I go to the precinct and check on people and work with the precinct commander. And it was a lot. But I'll turn it over to Phillipe, because Phillipe was on the community side of this.
Yeah, well, hi everyone. My name is Phillipe Cunningham. As the mayor said, I am the new city council member representing the 4th Ward in North Minneapolis. Just to give a little bit of quick background about me, before moving to Minneapolis, I worked with kids for my entire career. Prior to being appointed to the mayor's office, I was a youth worker and also a special education teacher on the south side of Chicago. And I worked in a very high crime area. I worked in West Englewood, and I worked with kids with some of the most challenging disabilities. So I was very intentional about that, and that experience really is what launched me into being interested in municipal politics and policy in general. And then we had mentioned the Youth Violence Prevention Executive Committee. That was actually, as a community member, that was my pathway into having a voice in the city. So I highly recommend folks check out boards and commissions because it's a really awesome way to be able to get your foot in the door and voice heard. So I brought a lot of youth development experience, and as well as having organized young people around public policy as well. And so when I was in the mayor's office, the Jamar Clark shooting was very challenging to be a young black man in the middle of the system as the system is responding to systemic oppression and to essentially what feels to the community as a state-sanctioned murder, right? And so I personally was having my own feelings as I was going through this, having to process the real-time trauma as that was coming up. But also, I saw all my friends who were down on the front lines of the protest down at the precinct, so the occupation. I just have to say, what resonates with me and still shakes me to this day is that Jamar Clark was killed 61 seconds after the officers showed up, correct? Mm-hmm. So, that in of itself is something that I think a lot of folks were just that piece of information, folks were really, that was what hurt, I think, a lot. It's that man showed up ready to kill, and that's how folks felt about it. And so here I was in the mayor's office. I'm an activist. I see myself as an activist in a suit. I believe that it's possible to dismantle white supremacy from within the system, which is why I ran for office and why I do the work that I do now. But my friends were unable to still see me as an ally, as somebody to go to because I was calling every last one of them, being like, just please talk to me. Like, I can help tell you, like, what are good things that you could actually negotiate. Like, y'all are asking about the grand jury, and that's the county judge, that's not the mayor. And so, like, trying to help folks better understand the pathways of, like, what is actually the mayor's job. But folks would not actually engage with me. And so they were using their political capital for things that really were outside of her control. And so that was incredibly frustrating, being inside the system and being like, hey, y'all, that's the wrong direction, and not really having that reflected back. So that is one of the things, as a council member now, that I do very intentionally. I was able to build a lot of really good relationships while I was in the mayor's office, but really begin to build that inside-outside strategy. So as somebody who is within the system, understanding how the system works, and then having my folks pushing from the outside on a mutual strategy, we're able to actually get things done. And so one of the deeply frustrating pieces about the occupation was the firewall that the other organizers put up between themselves and actually folks within the system. I'm not the only one who was reaching out, being like, hey, like, talk to me. There was a firewall that was put up. And so, and that really came from a place of trauma. Folks were thick in it at the moment. And so there was a lot of that went up. And so there was a lot of healing that had to be done after the occupation ended. My role, one of the bodies of work that I did within the system focused on young people was that it was Thanksgiving weekend, so there was a 3-day weekend, and the occupation was still happening. And I'm thinking to myself, like, whoa, the kids are going to be just like around, like they're just going to be present at the precinct, and we have to be intentional about making sure that their developmental needs are met while also being able to demonstrate their First Amendment rights. And so, so I pulled together a call with MPD, with the schools, with the parks, with the county, with other departments within the city to make sure that we had 2 children's crisis mental health workers on site and 10 youth workers on site who were just kind of like floating around talking to young folks. And it was kind of funny because I watched a video of one of the children's mental health workers like speaking, and they're like, this is what, community looks like. We bring these resources out. And I was like, yeah, I did that. But but I did it from within the system, and like folks didn't realize that, like, yes, an activist did this, but it was from within the system that I coordinated these resources. So that was my big piece of the role actually there. And I would say that the last thing that I can touch on, and then we can maybe dig into more specifics, but it's really interesting is the word I'll go with, being in a city that has experienced 2 officer-involved shootings within one term. And it's challenging to me as a North Sider. So the Jamar Clark shooting happened in North Minneapolis. I'm a North Sider, now I represent the North Side. And when Justine was shot, here we have a white yoga teacher from Australia, a Somali man who is a cop, complete, like the narrative, you couldn't get more opposite, I swear. And all of the North Side just kind of froze. I feel like there was like a collective like pain that happened because we then had to, there were lessons that were learned through Jamar, the Jamar situation. There was so much learned, as we heard here today. And then that was activated in the second officer-involved shooting. And I understood that logically watching it happen. Like, there were so many lessons that were learned, but it was still very hard for me to watch those lessons be learned on the North Side, right? Like, and so that was, that is a part of the challenge that I think I had not emotionally prepared myself for and still am working through. I did not make a public statement on Justine because I was so privately holding the space for my community because so many folks were hurting so much watching this happen, like, going through the motions and doing things like better, honestly, because the lessons have been learned, and that's what you do. You learn from your lessons, and you do better next time. But I think, though, the pain, particularly in the Black community in North Minneapolis, there was a re-traumatization that happened as a result of that second officer-involved shooting, even though the narrative could not get, like, the story could not get further removed from one another. So just wanted to name that as well in experience.
Mayor, do you want to talk about some of the lessons you learned?
I can yeah, I mean, I can say a few of the lessons that were learned, but I'd like to open it up for questions because we've been talking for a while. One of the things I think Councilmember Cunningham is referring to is that during the occupation, in part because of advice from the DOJ, because we were trying to negotiate an ending to it every day, there was some communicating I couldn't do and was advised not to do because I didn't want to have an impact on the negotiations that we were trying to do. I didn't let people know how much I was negotiating behind the scenes, but people experienced that as me being absent, me not caring, me not doing anything. And the other lesson I learned was that people wanted me to show my feelings more.
Yeah.
And that expectation infuriated me because it was completely gendered. Philando Castile, who was also shot in Minnesota next door to Minneapolis, and the demonstrations happened in St. Paul, where the mayor at the time was a friend of mine and a white man, met with some of the exact same people I had met with. And they had come that night that Nicole talked about when Molotov cocktails were thrown. Protesters showed up at my house, somehow expecting I would be there. I was not there. It's a funny story, which I could tell you sometime. There's a funny aspect to the story. But it was terrifying because I didn't know who was going. I learned from someone that protesters were going to my house. I didn't know who. I didn't know what their intention was. I didn't know if they were going to try and set my house on fire or what they wanted because I didn't know who it was. But I was at City Hall, right, on the phone, as Nicole was saying. For dinner that night, I remember this so clearly. I had beef jerky out of the vending machine and an apple that someone had given me. That was my dinner that night. And I didn't go home until 4 a.m. either. There's still a myth in the community that I was home that night and hiding
Yes.
upstairs.
Drinking wine. She doesn't even drink.
I don't drink. I haven't had a drink in 28 years, but okay. But my husband actually let them in and talked to them. You can watch the live stream of it. My husband is African American. He was an activist and a long-term advocate, very well known in the community. I'll just say it that way. Very well known in the community. And at first I was like, babe, you gotta leave the house. I don't know what's going on. And he was like, I'm not being run out of my house. And he stayed and he invited them in and then talked about the principles of nonviolent protest and whether or not they were being followed, which I'll just leave that right there. Yeah. So, but you can, and I didn't know. All I knew was that one of the inspectors I was with the police department at the time. They're like, ma'am, he let them in? And I was like, oh my God. Don't let the cats out. So then the next day, when some folks came to my office, some of them who'd been at my house the night before and some other people, they came into my office. All this is live streamed as well, and you can watch it. And they said, are you even human? You're not showing your emotions. We can't tell if you even care that Jamar Clark was shot. And I said, look, I may not show emotion the way you think a woman should, but here's how I show that I care, right? I have showed up every day of being mayor and done the work to advance as best as possible with the levers in my hand, the work of racial equity in this city, and I gave examples. But to this day, there are still people who are angry with me for me, they're angry because I pointed out the sexism. To them, they're upset because it wasn't sexism. They just wanted me to show my feelings more. Regardless, it's clear to me whether the expectation is sexist or not, and it is. Because when they met with Chris Coleman, I said, did they ask you to show your feelings more? And he said, no, somehow they did not ask me to be more expressive. But I realized that it would be useful if I could do that regardless of whether or not I should be asked to. And so, when when Justine Damon was shot, the communication was consistent because I had learned and because people had asked me to do this. The communication was immediate and consistent for days on end. And I talked about how I felt about what happened. And yes, people got very upset with me for handling that situation differently than the situation on the north side. And at that, I was in a double bind, right? Not a double standard, it's just a double bind. And women face many double binds. Not just that the expectations are different for us than they are for men, but that there's no way to meet any of the expectations leveled at us because because there are two sets of expectations. You're either smiling too much or not smiling enough. There's no smiling just the right amount. But I had to do what I thought was the right thing to do, and I was being responsive to what people had asked me to do, and I did that to the best of my ability. That a lot was the lesson learned, was about communication. Yeah. Was about communication, how to do it, when to do it. It was the thing that people wanted that they didn't get, in part because that had been the advice from the DOJ, but I now know it would have been better to communicate even in part because the negotiations actually did not result in people leaving, but we tried. That was one of the biggest lessons learned. So, and the other lesson I learned was, and I wrote an article in the Huffington Post about this about a month ago, an open letter to elected officials that young people are protesting against. Because there were protesters who showed up at events I was at for months afterwards, surrounding me on stage, yelling at me, snatching the microphone, trying to take my stuff, calling me names. And I had consistent offers to meet with them that were not taken up. And I had to then say, okay, look, that may be the only conversation I have with them. Right? This may be the only conversation I have with them is what they're yelling and chanting. And I sat down one day and I got very, very quiet. This is the bonus of being sober for 28 years is you get a set of tools about how to deal with your feelings and life. And I said, Betsy, if you can set aside the fear of being protested that way, and it's supposed to be scary for me, and it was. If I can set aside my anger and resentment about being protested that way, which is a natural response to being called names and being scared. My mom always said, it doesn't matter how you feel is how you feel. It's what you do about it that matters. If I could set that aside, what were they saying? These young people. And I wrote an article about this for the Huffington Post, exhorting these leaders who are currently being protested on gun issues. Listen to what they're saying. I've been in your seat. I know it's scary. I know the range of feelings. And there are ways to set that aside. And what are they saying? And what I could hear they were saying is, we want to abolish the police department. And I wasn't going to do that. That just wasn't on my policy agenda. But what I could also hear is, we want to take more, we don't need you. We can police ourselves. Get rid of the police department. We can do this. We know our neighborhoods better than you do. What I could hear in that was, we want to take more responsibility for public safety in our neighborhoods. And so in my next budget, I invested over $1 million in community-based strategies for public safety, including a first-of-a-kind strategy where I got technical assistance from Cities United, the group that also put together that mayor's guide, came in, and we just let the community say, here's what we can do. Develop those proposals, community assess those proposals based on community-generated criteria, and then they chose which proposals they wanted to invest in, and the city invested in that. The city did not choose what was invested in. The community invested in itself using city dollars. First time that came out of my head as a part of sitting down and saying, what were they asking for? And so it really helped me see that public safety is law enforcement and community together. It creates more safety and it builds trust if you invest in the community. So that was the other lesson learned, listen. Even you have to sort through the words to get to the impact, to get to the impulse, to get to what people were really trying to say, but I did my best to do that.
So the last thing before we take questions is the lasting legacy of all of this and that investment is our new police chief, Madeira Arredondo. When the mayor appointed him, she asked, what do you want to, what can I do to help you further your vision for the police department? And he asked for something called community navigators. He asked for 24.
Yes.
24 FTEs in a budget is a lot. But the mayor said, let's try to get 8. So we put 8 in the budget. City council approved 4. So we're starting a pilot this year, and this is something that I'm working on right now, is building this community navigator program so that we have civilians who can assist officers in the response and investigations that happen when police are called and they're not the most appropriate response, right? Mm-hmm. So we say you can't police your way out of this problem or this problem or this problem, but what has anybody put forward as a solution for that? Mm-hmm. And this is that. And so we're going to hopefully continue to grow it with the council members' support. But,
and Chief Arredondo was here as one of my study group participants, and he is, when Nicole mentioned that, that group that got together, and it was, the deputy and then later assistant chief who was part of that clutch of people who built those relationships, that was Chief Arredondo. And so when it came time to appoint a new chief, it was clear to me who the right choice was. And Chief Arredondo is also one of the legacies appointing him was one of the legacies I'm proud of in my time as mayor. So that's a lot. What questions do you have?
Hi, thank you for doing this. When you say that as a result of the interventions and the discussions, you were able to implement some community-based recommendations, can you tell us what they were?
I will give the big picture outline, and Nicole can flesh it out more. I invested in something called GVI, Group Violence Intervention, which is a community-led strategy where community members, members of government, members of law enforcement come together, pull in the guys that we know are most likely to be the next person to shoot someone or be shot themselves. And we basically, and community members are there to say the violence has to stop. And we say, look, we love you, we want you alive, and not in jail. And we will give you resources to make the changes needed in your life to get out of harm's way. If you don't choose to take it, that's up to you. But the first group who commits a homicide is going to get enhanced law enforcement attention. And not just you, not just the shooter, but every member of that group. And when we did our second call-in, we had pictures to show, yes, the last time we did a call-in, this group was the most violent and had shot the first, committed the first homicide, and there were 37 arrests and people had been sent to prison. And that kind of was shocking. But the flip side is, the people whose phone number they had like one phone number, and we know if that phone rings, it's somebody who wants help, was oversubscribed within weeks. And there are all these guys trying to get out of the life and getting help, and it works. It helps create more safety. And in that first year, there were half as many gang-related homicides in that year than there had been in the same period the previous year. So group violence, mental health co-responder strategy to have social workers on calls where it's a mental health issue, and then the collaborative public safety strategies that I described, that investment in the community.
So in the collaborative safety strategies, we did one in North Minneapolis in our predominantly African-American community, and one in a South Minneapolis in our Native American Indigenous community. And that resulted in, I think, 11 proposals being funded, anywhere from like a neighborhood patrol to, it was called the Man Up Club, which was a dynamic group of young men who came together on a regular basis with mentorship. And these were people that were most at risk in this neighborhood and didn't have a place to go. And when they had a place to go and they had this great mentorship and role models that they connected with, and we're talking like real active people in our community in a bad way, in a negative way, or potentially being drawn into that because they didn't have any other supports. We met with them one night, and they shared some really interesting stories with us, and including one that this group of young men themselves and one another supporting each other have prevented an act of retaliation that would have resulted in a homicide. So it's providing this capacity to the community to be able to step in and do this work that they know that they can do.
There was community mural programs that got all kinds of people involved in creating a piece of art that itself would be a way of illuminating a space that had a lot of crime in it. But the participation itself in the creation of the art was also a public safety strategy. And I'll just say the Man Up program, Corey Dean, if he's ever listening to this, thank you, Corey, for your work. So there were a lot of those strategies.
And I would say as well, the anti-police terror project in Oakland, California has a lot of community developed strategies as well, if you're interested in digging more into that.
Other question?
Hi. So I just Google searched what happened to the police officers who shot Jamar Clark, and according to this, they were not disciplined. And yet the Somali police officer was. I'm just curious about the message that sent to the community. And I'm also wondering if there's anything set in place that would make sure that now, today, if the Jamar Clark shooting had happened, those police officers might have been disciplined.
The way the process works is because we did an independent investigation, somebody else does the investigation. I also asked for a civil rights investigation at the federal level. And so those two investigations happened. Some of it was shared information. The Bureau of Criminal Apprehension at the state level did the investigation of Jamar Clark. But that happens first, and then there's a criminal investigation. And if the county attorney had charged the two officers for shooting Jamar Clark, that would have been a different situation. The last piece of that process is the city examines only whether or not city policy had been violated, right? That's the only discipline the city can enact. And so in the Jamar Clark situation, shooting, death, the county attorney did not charge those officers. You can watch the video. He sort of walks through why. But what we did change, we had a de-escalation policy, but we didn't put enough training into de-escalation strategies for officers. So now they get more de-escalation training. They have more tools in their toolkits to de-escalate a situation. 61 seconds is a very short amount of time to go from arrival to death.
And we'll say that Jamar Clark did not have a weapon.
And he did not have a weapon.
Yeah, we haven't named that.
When they were trying to take him down to the ground to subdue him, Jamar Clark landed his back to the officer's stomach and the officer's back was on the ground, and they started grappling. And what the officer reports and what the DNA evidence showed, according to the county attorney, was that Jamar Clark did indeed get hold of the weapon, of the officer's weapon. And the officer said to his partner, "He's got my gun, you have to shoot him," and the officer shot him.
And Jamar Clark made a statement at that point, too, that said, "You're going to have to shoot me."
Yes, that was reported what he said. So that as far as policy goes, we didn't have a de-escalation policy that they violated, which I don't know what the situation is now. That was in the works when I left. In the Mahmoud Noor situation, we don't know why he shot Justine Damond. He has basically, everybody has their Fifth Amendment rights not to testify against themselves, whether they're an employee or not. All we know is that she called in and said there's a sexual assault happening in the alley behind my house. They got called to the scene were driving down the alleyway, sort of looking. Officer Noor was in the passenger side, and he hasn't said anything, but his partner says, I saw a movement out of the corner of my eye, and then I saw a big flash of light, and when I looked over, there was a woman on the ground who'd been shot. And it is not police policy to shoot across your, it's not police policy to shoot because you're startled, if that is indeed what happened. It is not MPD policy to shoot across your partner. It was not MPD policy that they did not have their body cameras on. But that was a gray area in policy that we have now made starkly black and white. And because he hasn't made a statement, and he's been charged with a crime, once that happens, that's a different situation for the city and the mayor, as they made. I wasn't there. I didn't make the decision about whether or not to fire him, but the chief and the mayor had to come to that conclusion themselves about what to do once he'd actually been charged with that crime.
If I can also just add, so Noir is actually not the only officer who has remained quiet. Actually, due to the Police Federation, all of the officers were told not to talk. And apparently, according to the city or the county attorney, that was the first time that they've ever had to subpoena officers like that. And so, because they had been told by the Police Federation to not speak, which actually kind of connects to talking about discipline, is around the police contract. And having more transparency and conversations around what the police contract looks like, what goes into it, who has a say in that. There's lots of components, but I think that when we talk about police accountability, folks can really overlook that piece of it. But the reason why we can't hold officers accountable when they do, for example, violate policy, is because a lot of times the union will arbitrate them to be able to come back. And so they're able to come back. And so the previous police chief would fire officers knowing that they would still come back, Well, it was a little, prior to my administration, that's what would happen. The chief, who was chief most of my time as mayor, and you're absolutely right, they grieve everything, and arbitrators around the country, not just in Minneapolis, tend to side with the arbitrator, which is why you fire somebody and yet they're still on the police force. One of the successes that we had is that Chief Harteau, the prior chief, had been so clear about what her expectations were, and she made everybody sign a document. Every officer signed a document saying, yes, I understand what the expectations are. That when it did come to arbitrations, we won more of them than we ever had historically, because the expectations were so clear, that it was clear that that expectation had been violated, and it was also clear that the officer knew what the expectation was. And so we didn't win every arbitration, but we won more of them than we usually would have. But around the country, and it is still true everywhere, the law is on the side of the officer. If they say that they felt like their life was in danger, there's a lot that they are excused from. And so that is a point of contention. And to say, the Police Federation, I will invite you to Google #Pointergate. That my first year as mayor, I Pointed at somebody.
I went and door knocked right before the election in 2014 with some community members over north, and then took a picture with one of the people I'd been door knocking with, and we pointed at each other, pretty awkwardly, but we pointed at each other, and took the photo. And then I put news in hashtags, quotes, a local news station, KSTP, did a story that said that I was flashing gang signs. And quoted in that story was the head of the Police Federation at the time, who said that I had to choose between gangs and cops. It went viral. It was the top trend on Twitter for 2 or 3 days. The Daily Show did a story about it. But that's the Police Federation in Minneapolis. And then they voted out that particular head of the president of the union and voted in somebody who was more adversarial and more conservative. I'll just say it that way.
It's nice of you to say.
Yeah. And so that meant that, I didn't know this part about, telling people not to talk to talk to investigators at all, but I'm not surprised to hear it.
Well, and there's a nuance on that too, is that every public employee has a right to guarantee.
Yes.
Something called guarantee. And in order to do this, they would have had to waive their guarantee. So, I mean, it's another dynamic.
Another question.
Great, thank you. Mike, I was wondering about the relationship between Minneapolis and other governments, especially as these progressive police reforms were being enacted, and then during and after the uprising. What was your relationship like with the state, with neighboring cities like St. Paul, with other major cities like St. Louis, or Baltimore that have had these kinds of experience? How did changing the police, changing the way policing is done in Minneapolis change the relationship that Minneapolis had with other governments?
That's a two-part question. Like in the moment and in the crucible itself, we had information from other cities. I talked to other mayors who'd been through it. People were very kind. But most of that information came through things like the after-action reports, lessons learned, here's what you do. I got personal support from mayor friends from around the country. But other levels of government in Minnesota, the governor did his best to try and negotiate a peaceful conclusion. And thought he had come to some agreement. There were things that he said he would do for the protesters. He did not secure from them an agreement that they would leave. So he I think he assumed that they would leave if he, given these things that he said he would do, but in the end they did not. In the end they did not. Congressman Ellison, who some know because he ran for DNC chair, he's the current vice chair. He was a staunch ally and supporter. He was very, very helpful. He stood up with me at a press conference near the end asking for the occupation to end, saying that that was the right thing for the city, along with a lot of other leaders from the community, a lot of African-American leaders who signed on. And him standing up with me meant other people felt they could stand up with me too. They agreed with me, but it was a risky thing to do and for them to say, and some of them paid a price for it, and I'm to this day grateful that they did it. But the governor also said yes when it came time to do an independent investigation and have his state agency do that investigation. We tried to stay, the county attorney was, you're going to have to make a decision based on this investigation, so it's important to keep you informed about what's happening, but I don't want to give the appearance that I'm trying to guide things in one way or another. It's not my decision to make. So there were, and part of the reason I was on the phone so much is I was calling legislators, Hennepin County commissioners, community members, community leaders, giving updates. This is what's happening. This is what we're doing. And so it wasn't like I wasn't communicating. It was just that there were people who wouldn't talk to me. And so then they didn't know what I was doing because I wasn't broadcasting it in the newspaper or on television, because the people who wouldn't talk to me would then hear on television about what I was trying to do with them, and that's an awkward way to do a negotiation. And so it was a little bit challenging to figure out how to communicate where there was a negotiation happening. I mean, when Justine Damond was killed, there wasn't an occupation, so there was nothing to negotiate. And so it was much easier to communicate. It was just much easier to do because there wasn't any kind of negotiation I was going to jeopardize through my communications.
So thank you, but I'm going to take a moment to make a couple of comments, if I could. We had originally called this, I don't know how many of you know, we did an event earlier in the year called Dispatches from the Front Lines of Community Justice. And we had originally thought of identifying this as Dispatches 2. We changed it to Lessons Learned from the Front Line to tone it down a little bit. But I think in listening to it, I think we would have done well to have called it Dispatches from the Front Line of Community Justice. And I say that specifically because I think something that we believe very strongly in is modeled here. And it has to do with the fact that people in communities need to have a say in what works. That's what community justice is. That's exactly what it means. And our elected officials have to be willing to hear that and to listen. So I'll say one other thing about Mayor Hodges, I think. And when I first met her, thanks to Isaac, and I walked into her office, and the first thing I saw was Wonder Woman. And I thought, well, this has got to be a remarkable person, right? And she is. I mean, and I think that the Wonder Woman part is not the superhero; it's the decent human being. And I think I really appreciate that about her, and I think she's really lucky to have had you all working with her. I also want to say that we did find you because Isaac understood what community justice means to us, and Isaac found the story about the $1 million, right? And he came to me and he said, this is really amazing, you know, we should look into that. So, having embarrassed him that much, I'll say, today is also Isaac's birthday. And so, we have a card for you, and I want to wish you a happy birthday.
Yay.
And with that, thank you all.
Happy
So you have to
birthday
read that card, outside of that card, out loud.
Anyone can be cool, but awesome takes practice.
Yay.
Yeah. Thank you, Isaac, and thank you all so very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity.